Let me just begin by just acknowledging that developmental science is increasingly being referenced by judges and legislatures and others who have used this evidence as support for more lenient treatment of juvenile offenders. And it's the case that developmental science is referenced to in the past 10 years in significant cases brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, beginning with Roper versus Simmons, where we basically get the abolishment of the death penalty for juveniles, and then the more recent case in which we now have the ruling of unconstitutional for parole, for life without parole for any offenders, even those that commit homicide. And in all of these cases, there's a reference to diminished cognitive capability of the juvenile relative to the adult. But there are actually some commonalities in the case for Miller and Jackson that I want to highlight in presenting converging psychological and neuroscientific evidence that really differentiates a juvenile offender from an adult offender. And these include the influence of emotions and the influence of peers on our actions and our behaviors. And both Miller and Jackson were 14-year-old males. There was a complex emotional situation in which the homicides took place, and in both cases peers were present, or their accomplices were peers. And so that will be work that I highlight. But it's really statistics that we see, such as this one, where we note this inflection during the adolescent period of criminal acts, and how that increases. Basically here what we're plotting is it begins to increase around 13 years of age, peaks around 17, and then it slowly begins to drop again. I want to come back to this notion of transient inflections in behavior and transient changes that we're seeing in the brain that are converging with those. But statistics like these really sort of beg the question of what is going on in the adolescent brain. And the adolescent brain, or teen brain, has really gotten a lot of splash in the media. We call it the media darling lately. But I want to try to unpack some of the changes that are occurring. And so building on Jeff's beautiful presentation this morning, let me just show you in a simplified cartoon the many different changes that are going on the brain, referencing some of the terms that he so nicely explained to you. And so first is to recognize that across, let's see if I can just use this cursor here if you can see it, that this is myelination. This is the white matter that Jeff was referring to, and we're seeing continued changes across childhood and adolescence into adulthood. At the same time, the synapses that he was talking about, their increase in subsequent pruning, are regional in nature in terms of the regions in which you get the peak and subsequent plateau. And so areas where we see or we move, like visual motor areas, are developing before regions where we use that information to guide goal-oriented or future behaviors. And then at the same time, what's happening around adolescence is brain regions are being marinated in hormones that are surging and changing during this time, and we have to recognize that it's really much more complex than the somewhat simplistic story that I'm going to tell you today. But at least it gives you some of the punchlines of the evidence that we have today from developmental neuroscience. And while I could show you these cartoons all day, I think movies and pictures are worth 1,000 words. So this is just showing you that notion of regional development of the brain from school age to around the end of college, 5 to 21 years of age. And where you see areas that are blue, it's brain areas that are reaching adult levels, or cortical thickness in this case, relative to areas that are red that are continuing to change from childhood into adulthood. So what you may be noticing in this movie is that one of the areas that is taking the most time is this area in the prefrontal cortex to develop. And I think maybe if I show a static image rather than going through the movie, This is looking down on top of the brain. You're looking over someone. And now you can see those same motor areas and visual regions in the back. And then in the front, you're seeing significant changes that are still occurring from childhood to adulthood. Now, this is just on the surface, the cortex. But when we think about adolescence, we think about desire, we think about rage, we think about fear and flight and retreat. And so it's also the case, here's like a glass brain. If you look to see just where structural changes are occurring from childhood to adulthood, that yes, these areas in fuchsia are in the frontal cortex. They're still showing significant changes, but we're also getting subtle changes in these deep structures that are very important for learning about emotions and the significance of cues in the environment. So one of the notions that has really evolved from the developmental neuroscience is that there is a tension between systems that are deep in the brain and those that are more cortical in nature. So that interactions between the prefrontal cortex that Jeff talked about in terms of planning or reasoning or regulation of our behavior are still developing at a time when fine-tuning and development of these emotional centers has already really begun. And so sort of the disconnect is the communication between these two as the circuit is forming with experience across development. And this has been referred to as an imbalance model. And again, I just want to show you a movie here where basically where you're seeing red are those deep primitive structures in the brain. And the idea is that they're developing and also more activated with changes in neurotransmitters and hormones during the adolescent period, so that if you call on each one of these systems simultaneously in a situation where the teenager has to make a decision, that these emotional centers are going to tend to win out over the more rational prefrontal ones. And then for any Star Trek, we're old enough in this audience, people are familiar with Star Trek. Another analogy people have used is thinking about the prefrontal cortex as the vulcanized part of the brain, and that's Mr. Spock, and his pairing with, of course, Kirk, Captain Kirk, who sometimes flies a little bit by the seat of his pants. And so it's a beautiful marriage when they come together, but when they get out of balance, there need to be checks on that. But it goes again simply saying that the reason teenagers do what they do is because of a poorly matured prefrontal cortex. It's a combination of the circuitry forming and how the prefrontal cortex is also talking to differential development in these emotional centers of the brain too. It might set them apart, not only from adults, but also children. But how do we link the changes that we're seeing in the brain, how do we link that to behavior? And one of the ways that we do this in the laboratory is to look at impulse control, and that's come up a lot in the discussion already in terms of talking about disorders of ADHD. But impulse control is also something that we typically sort of use when we're describing teenagers. They're too impulsive, they don't think before they act. And so I want to just take you through how we measure this in the laboratory and how we can look at developmental differences and also point out individual differences. Now, there are a number of neuroscientists in the audience have performed this impulse control task before, so I thought it would be great to see how well judges do. And just to make it more interesting, we thought we would use cartoon characters. This is a mole that I'm going to ask you to whack anytime you see him in the garden, because clearly he's going to destroy your garden. And then this should be a radish or a turnip, not an eggplant, because they don't emerge from the ground. But and I grew up on a farm, but my graduate students are city folk. And I found it so amusing that I just can't change the task or the slides. And I know some of you I've shared this with before. But anyway, what you don't want to do is you don't want to destroy your produce, right? You want to keep the mole from doing that. So all I want you to do is to just yell whack whenever you see the mole, and he can be tricky sometimes, but please don't say whack when the vegetable appears. And you need to go quickly on these tasks, so go as quickly as you can, and let's just let the judges see how well they do here. Okay? So are you ready?
Ready.
Okay.
Whack, whack, whack.
Faster.
Whack, 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 whack.
Whoop. So I think one or two of you may have squashed the eggplant. They were coming up fairly quickly, so it was a little bit difficult. But let me just show you that you're not alone if you made an error, because there's a lot of variability. This is just plotting performance as a function of age, and this measure, D prime, is just really signal detection. It's incorporating the times in which you correctly identified that the mole was there, and also the percentage of times that you correctly stopped yourself from not responding when you weren't supposed to. And yes, impulse control does increase with age. But please note that there are adolescents who are performing better and can perform better on this task than adults. So this is where we want to begin to show some individual data. However, when people are interested in developmental questions, they usually don't plot all the individual data points. Instead, they put them in these neat little boxes, and this is how many errors you make. This is children, adolescents, and adults, and now it looks like it's this nice decrease with age in terms of how well you can control your impulses. Let's take it a step further. If this had been the task you were doing in the scanner today or tomorrow, whenever some of you are, if you were and you were performing this task, there have been numerous studies that have shown that a region in the prefrontal cortex, this area in the ventral inferior frontal gyrus, is associated with your performance and how well you perform. And also, if you look developmentally, just on the trials where everybody was correctly performing the task, we see that there's a developmental in this region. And if you then look at this region as a function of how many errors they made and how much activity, we see that that's correlated with behavior. But again, there's a lot of variability. But this is impulse control. There is nothing here that makes an adolescent look special from a child and an adult, right? It looks like children should be by far worse than adolescents in terms of their actions and behaviors. But that's not what we're seeing in the inflection with statistics in terms of criminal behavior. So what the psychological research and the neuroscientific research have been trying to do is to sort of understand this inflection point and what's driving that. So one of the issues that comes to mind are situations in which you have to have self-control. And one for many of us, once our metabolism slows down, it's still surprising that we could probably all climb Mount Everest on a single Krispy Kreme donut. It's a little bit frustrating. But what we need to keep in mind are sort of how incentives influence our behavior and how well we are. This person's very good at waiting and getting all the cream in between that Oreo before having the cookie. But how they influence our behavior too, and how that changes as a function of development, and specifically looking at how adolescents are responsive to incentives and rewards. Money, positive social cues, a smile. And so it's not just the developmental work, but there's a large literature that shows, even without our conscious awareness, where we can't repeat back to you what sort of led to a reward or money in laboratory tasks, you still see changes in behavior. So let me just illustrate this in a task we performed at the Sackler Institute. Adriana Galvan, who's part of our developmental network group that's looking at adolescent behavioral and brain development, actually developed this task. And basically all she did was ask participants to tell her what side of the screen a pirate was presented on. They just pressed a left or right button. But unbeknownst to the subject, and most of the subjects got these correct, because it's not hard to say if something's appearing on the left or the right. But unbeknownst to them, each one of these stimuli were associated with a bigger outcome. So if they got it right, they either got one coin, a handful of coins, or a lot. We didn't use dollars because the adolescents started making it into this arithmetic problem. So they were calculating how much they'd earned over the course of the experiment to make sure that we gave them the right amount. But if you have them participate in this study, you see across adolescents and adults that over the course of the experiment, individuals began to change their behavior so they're faster to stimuli that are associated with a large reward, and they actually get significantly slower to those that are associated with no or minimal rewards, such as a single coin. Now, if we then look to see how that's represented in the brain, how do we represent rewards in the brain? There's a whole circuit, but I just want to focus on an area that has robustly shown differences specifically for the adolescent, and that's this area in the ventral striatum, or nucleus accumbens. It's an area that may be referenced when we speak about addiction research, but it's definitely important in learning about rewards and positive outcomes and learning how to predict those. So now, rather than just having a whack-the-mole task, now let's have you perform a task. I don't want you to get test anxiety here. I'm not going to have you do another task, but now let's take a cue that over a lifetime we have associated with positive outcomes, such as a smiling face. What do we see then when you have the impulse control task across development? Something very different happens. When you ask teenagers not to press to a smiling face relative to neutral ones, what you see is the teenagers, not the children or the adults, are making many more of those false alarms. They're pressing when they're not supposed to. Like they can't even help themselves. They're just driven by these social positive cues. And then if we look in the brain to see what area maps onto this developmental difference, we see this area again in the ventral striatum that I've mentioned before. It's a deep structure in the brain. So in receipt and anticipation of reward, we're seeing elevated activity in this region relative to children and adults. And to now link it to some of the criminal behaviors we're seeing where they're engaging in really risky choices and behaviors, what we know is the activity in this region to reward is also associated with the likelihood of them engaging in risky behaviors. So that's just a correlation for individuals, ratings on risky behaviors they engage in, which are questions such as everything from leaving a party with a stranger to engaging even in positive sort of risk sports, rock climbing and the sort. But these two are associated. Now that's how incentives can cause us to be a little bit more impulsive, but particularly during this window of the adolescent period. How about potential threat? Because in many of the crimes that you're probably dealing with, it's the anticipation of threat or a negative emotional experience that might be occurring. So if you simply superimpose cues such as this, a fearful face, which over a lifetime we've learned to associate with something is wrong somewhere, so I need to just determine what is the emotional significance of this. What we see with adolescents' behavior, impulse control tasks, is they're activated by these cues as opposed to withdrawing from them, which is the typical response. And let me just show you that again. So relative to their accuracy to threat faces relative to these neutral ones, adolescents are making many more of these false alarms than adults, and also the children are making even fewer, completely withdrawing from these threat faces. And then what we know about threat cues is an area of the brain that's very important in learning about the emotional significance of it, and has also been implicated in not only fright, flight, but also in rage, is the amygdala. And now let me just show you here these little almond-shaped structures right here that Jeff alluded to. And these are, again, individual data, but what I hope that you can see from the back is that these are children, individual data points, these are adults, and there's great variability, but you don't see any of the children or adults activating this region like the adolescents are. So again, another example where we're getting converging evidence from both neuroimaging and behavior that's showing this change in behavior to particular emotional information. It's not just diminished cognitive ability, it has a lot to do with emotion too. So we may have been actually underestimating in some ways their abilities. And then I wanted to actually end with an example of the importance of peers and influence in our decisions, because that's one of the ways in which juvenile and adult crimes differ. Often the juvenile offenders are engaging in their behaviors with a group of peers. And this is work by Larry Steinberg, that, who has been a collaborator with Buffy, and it's really been a wonderful member of the network. And he developed a task, and it's really a crude video task, where he's basically asking individuals in the lab to decide whether or not they're going to go through an intersection when there's a yellow light. And depending on how close they are when they have to make that decision to the intersection. And there are really two outcomes. You can be successful and you can get through that intersection, or you can crash, which is what this is supposed to represent. Now, in addition to having the individuals play this game, and these were older adolescents and college students and young adults, he also had them perform it either with peers present or no peers present. And this is what's provocative in the data. And these are the behavioral results. First, if you can just focus, I know it's a busy slide, just focus on these blue bars. It's basically showing you for each developmental age group, there are no real differences in the number of risky behaviors or crashes that they make when no peer is present. But you put a peer in the room and you see a 50% increase in the number of risky choices they're making, and you also see that they're actually having more crashes. So this is really important for us to keep in mind in terms of how peers can influence actions, choices, and behaviors. But then again, recently they've used this task in the imaging environment, and what they saw is the area that discriminated between going versus not going in this risky point at the intersection with the yellow light was again this area in the ventral striatum. So you're seeing that the adolescents are activating this region more than either of the young adult groups. So what I've tried to do is give you or provide some illustrations of how, as a group, adolescents show compromised choices and actions, particularly in the heat of the moment, in the presence of either positive or negative cues that might signal potential threat, and also in the presence of peers. Sort of a question that's already beginning to come up is to what extent we can then take these findings and apply them to a given individual of that age group. Hopefully from plotting individual data points, you can see that that's going to be a much more difficult challenge. And Buffy Scott is going to be talking about this a little bit more, and I think it'll be a discussion that we'll have over the next 2 days. But basically we're at a point where the science really doesn't support such an inference from group to individual in these developmental data. The second sort of point that I hope I made through some of the neuroscience is this difficulty with regard to being able to suppress responses, particularly in emotional contexts, is associated with this tension between these emotional centers and prefrontal cortex, that when the circuitry is not fully developed, they can't dampen those emotional responses in an appropriate way so that they can then engage in the appropriate behaviors. So even though teens might know better, and they'll tell you this too, in the heat of the moment, it's as if that rational region was hijacked and they acted on impulse or made the decision that they did. And then third, I think it's very important to come back to this point that I mentioned at the beginning, and that is diminished self-control in these contexts. This is transient. The adolescent period is a normative period of development where an individual has to learn how, on their own, independent of the parent, how to make choices in society that allow them to live in that society. And so it's very important for them to have opportunities during this period to help wire that circuitry. You cannot lock up a child when they're 12 and bring them out when they're 21 and think that you're going to save them or teach them anything about how being an adult. So it's very important for us to recognize that this is a normative period of time, and for us to think in terms of ways that we can help them successfully go through that developmental stage so they don't end up in the justice system. And then just also to reiterate sort of the transientness of this, just based on the biology and the changes that are occurring from childhood to development. And to end, I know Owen mentioned briefly the subgroup of those of us in the network who are working on adolescent brain development, but I did want to just underscore what a collaborative group we are, and really what we're focusing on is the development of psychological capacities that we think are relevant to judgments of criminal responsibility. But in this list, you should note that there are almost as many legal scholars as there are neuroscientists or psychologists or neurologists who are really taking part in developing the tasks that we're using both in the scanner and the really intensive battery of behavioral measures that we're collecting too. But the question is really, so much of the citations of the developmental science have been just about cognitive capacity, but we may have underestimated the ability of the adolescent, particularly in sustained emotional confrontations, and how well they can then rationally react and respond to what's before them. And so a number of our paradigms that we're using are really looking at, not at these little flashing cues that I presented to you today, but putting them in states where they think at any moment something bad's going to happen. So they're either going to see as the fangs of a snake or of a wolf or a loud noise that they don't like, and we're having them make decisions during those periods of time to see how they differ from adults in their ability. And we're also countering that with arousal too. There are situations in which teenagers engage in behaviors with peers where there's this excitement and then things go wrong. So there are also opportunities in which they're engaged in these decision-making tasks, but they know during one epoch that at any time they could win as much as $100, and you get this excitement with sweat, just like you do if they think something bad's going to happen. And we see how well they can actually react relative to adults and children. And it's a very extensive battery that I'm not going to go through, but I think what I'd like to do now is segue into Buffy Scott's thoughts and presentations. So thank you.